If you think a $65 million plane was too much, if they discover that there's life on Mars, they gonna need to hear the gospel, and I'm gonna have to believe God for $1 billion space shuttle because we got to preach the gospel on Mars.
Pastor Creflo Dollar cries on live TV, and the moment immediately leaves viewers searching for answers. Reports begin spreading across social media, headlines start appearing everywhere, and many people wonder if one of the most famous pastors in America is really stepping away from ministry. As emotions rise, questions begin to grow. What caused Pastor Creflo Dollar to become so emotional on live TV? Did he truly resign? Or is there more to the story than the headlines are revealing? Behind the viral clips and dramatic reactions lies a surprising chain of events that has divided supporters, critics, and church leaders alike. The truth may be far different from what millions of people first believed. So what really happened during that unforgettable live TV moment? Join us to find out. The stunning live confession that stunned everyone. The room carried the familiar energy of a regular service, with thousands watching in person and online. Everything seemed routine at first, with cameras rolling and the audience ready for another message. Then Pastor Creflo Dollar began speaking in a noticeably different tone. As he shared a revised perspective on long-held teachings about church giving, the atmosphere shifted, and many realized they were witnessing a significant turning point in his ministry. For many longtime followers, this was hard to believe. They had listened to his sermons, read his books, watched his broadcasts, and followed his teachings for years. Some had built parts of their spiritual lives around lessons he had taught. Yet here he was, publicly admitting that he no longer agreed with some of the things he had previously preached. What made the moment even more powerful was that this was not a private conversation happening behind closed doors. It was unfolding in front of a live audience. Every word was being heard in real time. Every reaction was visible. Every pause seemed heavier than the one before it. As the message continued, many viewers began asking themselves the same question: what could have caused such a dramatic change? The answer was not a sudden event or a single disagreement. According to Dollar, it was the result of spending years studying Scripture more deeply and re-examining ideas he had once accepted without question. He explained that he had reached conclusions that differed from some of his earlier teachings. Instead of quietly moving on, he decided to address the issue openly. That decision alone surprised many observers. Public figures rarely admit mistakes, especially when those mistakes are connected to messages they have shared for decades. In many industries, people protect their reputation at all costs. They avoid controversy. They stay silent when difficult questions arise. Yet in this case, Dollar chose a completely different path. He stepped into the spotlight and addressed the issue head-on. The reaction was immediate. Some viewers praised what they saw as honesty and humility. They believed it took courage to publicly acknowledge a change in belief. Others were less impressed. Critics questioned why the change had taken so long. Some wondered how many people had been affected by the teachings over the years. Others debated whether the confession went far enough. Almost overnight, conversations began spreading across social media, churches, online forums, and Christian television programs. Supporters and critics found themselves discussing the same event, but reaching very different conclusions. What made the situation especially fascinating was that it touched on something larger than one pastor or one sermon. It raised questions about leadership, accountability, and what happens when influential people change their minds in public. Can a leader admit being wrong and still maintain trust? Will followers respect honesty, or will they feel disappointed? These questions quickly became part of the larger conversation. For viewers who had never followed Creflo Dollar closely, the moment served as an introduction to a much bigger story. His ministry had grown into one of the most recognized religious organizations in America. Through television broadcasts, conferences, books, and sermons, his influence had reached millions. Because of that influence, any major statement from him was almost guaranteed to attract attention. Yet this was different from the usual headlines. This was not about a new project, a church expansion, or an upcoming event. This was about a pastor revisiting his own teachings and telling the world that he now viewed some of them differently. For supporters, it was unexpected. For critics, it was significant. For the media, it was impossible to ignore. As news of the confession spread, another strange development began taking shape. Rumors started appearing online. Some reports exaggerated what had happened. Others completely misunderstood the message. Before long, dramatic headlines began circulating across the internet. Many people who never watched the original sermon started hearing versions of the story that were far more sensational than reality. This created a new layer of confusion. People were no longer just discussing the confession itself. They were trying to separate fact from fiction. Some believed the event marked a turning point in his ministry. Others wondered if even bigger changes were coming. Questions multiplied faster than answers. And that is where the story becomes even more interesting, because the stunning confession was only the beginning. Behind that moment was a much deeper story stretching back years, a story involving influence, controversy, prosperity teaching, public criticism, and a journey that few people fully understood. To understand why this confession shook so many people, we first need to look at how Creflo became one of the most powerful and talked about pastors in the world. And once that journey begins, the true scale of this story becomes impossible to ignore. Why this admission was so unexpected? To understand why this confession caused such a strong reaction, it is important to know who Creflo was before this moment. This was not a minor correction from a local pastor, but the story of a man whose voice reached millions across countries and generations. He built one of modern Christianity's most recognized ministries, which grew from a small church into a global organization. Through television, books, conferences, and online platforms, his teachings spread widely, often reaching people long before they ever met him in person. As his influence expanded, so did his reputation. Supporters admired his confidence, his communication skills, and his ability to explain spiritual ideas in a way that felt practical for everyday life. Many believed his messages inspired people to think positively, work hard, and trust God during difficult times. For years, countless viewers made his sermons part of their weekly routine. Because of that influence, his teachings carried significant weight. When he spoke, people listened. When he published books, people bought them. When he shared a new message, churches and ministries often discussed it. His words were not viewed as casual opinions. To many followers, they were important spiritual guidance. This is exactly why his recent admission felt so surprising. For decades, Dollar had been associated with teachings that connected faith, giving, and financial blessings. Whether people agreed with him or not, they knew where he stood. His position appeared clear and consistent. Many followers assumed those beliefs would remain unchanged for the rest of his ministry. That assumption turned out to be wrong. When he publicly revealed that he had reached different conclusions after studying Scripture more deeply, many viewers struggled to process what they were hearing. It was not simply a pastor updating a minor detail. It felt more like a teacher returning to a classroom after many years and announcing that one of his most important lessons needed to be reconsidered. The surprise became even greater because public figures rarely reverse positions that helped define their careers. Most people spend years protecting their image. They avoid admitting mistakes because they fear criticism, embarrassment, or losing support. The larger their audience becomes, the harder those admissions often feel. Yet Dollar chose to move in the opposite direction. Instead of ignoring questions or quietly changing course, he openly discussed his change in understanding. Whether people agreed with him or disagreed, many observers acknowledged that such a public admission was uncommon. It instantly became one of the most talked-about moments of his career. For some followers, the confession strengthened their respect for him. They believed it demonstrated a willingness to keep learning rather than pretending to know everything. In their view, growth sometimes requires admitting that previous conclusions were incomplete. Others viewed the situation differently. Some wondered why these changes had not happened sooner. Others questioned how the earlier teachings had influenced people over the years. Those questions created intense debates that spread across churches, social media platforms, and Christian communities worldwide. What made the situation even more fascinating was that both supporters and critics agreed on one thing. This was not an ordinary event. The confession challenged expectations that had existed for decades. It disrupted assumptions people had formed about his ministry. It forced followers and observers alike to re-examine what they thought they knew. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer focused only on money, giving, or theology. It became a discussion about leadership itself. What should happen when a leader changes his mind? How should followers respond? Can a person maintain credibility after publicly correcting earlier teachings? These questions became just as important as the confession that sparked them. As the debates continued, another moment from the sermon began attracting even more attention. Many people could hardly believe what they were hearing next. If the confession had already stunned viewers, what followed pushed the story to an entirely different level. Because soon, Creflo would make a request so unexpected that it would spread across news outlets, church discussions, and social media platforms around the world. It was a statement that left supporters stunned, critics talking, and countless viewers wondering whether they had heard him correctly. And that statement would become one of the most unforgettable moments of the entire controversy. The statement that stunned millions. If the confession had already surprised viewers, what happened next turned surprise into disbelief. As the message continued, Creflo Dollar moved beyond simply explaining that his understanding had changed. He took a step that very few public figures, especially those with decades of influence, would ever consider taking. Instead of defending everything he had taught in the past, he openly acknowledged that some of his previous materials contained teachings he no longer agreed with. For many people watching, this was the moment that truly changed the atmosphere. Books, teaching guides, recorded sermons, and study materials are often seen as a lasting part of a minister's legacy. They represent years of work, countless hours of preparation, and messages shared with audiences around the world. Most leaders spend their careers encouraging people to keep those materials, revisit them, and pass them on to others. Yet Dollar's message pointed in a very different direction. He indicated that if those older materials reflected teachings he now believed were incorrect, people should not continue relying on them. The statement spread rapidly across social media and news reports because it sounded almost unimaginable coming from someone with such a large platform. Viewers immediately understood the significance. This was not merely a small clarification hidden in a lengthy sermon. It was a public acknowledgement that some of the ideas attached to his name no longer represented what he believed. For longtime followers, hearing this was both surprising and emotional. Many had invested years studying those materials. Some had shared them with family members and friends. Others had built personal beliefs around lessons they learned from them. Critics saw the situation through a different lens. They questioned why such a dramatic correction came after many years. Some wondered how many people had been influenced by the earlier teachings before the change occurred. Others argued that the admission raised difficult questions about accountability and responsibility. The discussions quickly grew larger than the sermon itself. Christian leaders began sharing opinions. Religious commentators examined the implications. Online debates multiplied. People who had never attended his church suddenly found themselves discussing the controversy. Even those unfamiliar with his ministry became curious about what had happened. What made the moment especially powerful was the contrast between the past and the present. For decades, Creflo Dollar had been known as a confident communicator with firm convictions. His audience expected certainty. They expected direction. They expected answers. Now they were witnessing something very different. A leader publicly revisiting conclusions he had once presented with confidence. That contrast created a story that captured attention far beyond church circles. The event also revealed an important truth about influence. The larger a person's platform becomes, the greater the impact of their words. A private individual changing an opinion might affect a few friends or family members. A globally recognized pastor changing a major teaching can spark conversations across continents. This is exactly what happened. The statement became one of the most discussed moments in modern Christian media. Some people celebrated it, others criticized it. Many simply tried to understand it. But almost everyone agreed that it was remarkable. As the days passed, the controversy continued growing. New discussions emerged. Old debates resurfaced. Questions about prosperity teaching, church finances, leadership, and biblical interpretation returned to the spotlight. The story was no longer just about one sermon. It had become part of a much larger conversation. And while the statement itself was making headlines, an even bigger battle was quietly unfolding outside the church walls. The public reaction was becoming impossible to ignore. Supporters rushed to defend him. Critics intensified their scrutiny. Social media exploded with opinions from every side. News outlets picked up the story. Religious leaders weighed in. Suddenly, what started as a confession during a sermon had evolved into a nationwide debate. The storm was only beginning, and the backlash, praise, and public reaction would soon reveal just how divided people really were. Praise, backlash, and the truth behind the rumors. As the sermon continued spreading across television, websites, and social media platforms, the reaction became impossible to contain. What had started as a single message delivered to a congregation quickly turned into a worldwide conversation. Supporters, critics, pastors, commentators, and ordinary viewers all seemed to have an opinion. Some saw the moment as one of the bravest acts of honesty they had ever witnessed from a major religious leader. Others believed the confession raised difficult questions that could not be ignored. For many supporters, the situation was simple. They believed Creflo Dollar had demonstrated humility by publicly admitting that his understanding had changed. In a world where many public figures refused to acknowledge mistakes, they viewed his decision as a sign of maturity and personal growth. To them, the willingness to revisit long-held beliefs showed a commitment to learning rather than protecting an image. These supporters argued that changing one's position after deeper study should not be seen as a weakness. Instead, they believed it reflected a desire to follow truth wherever it leads. At the same time, criticism arrived just as quickly. Many critics questioned why such a major correction had taken so many years. Some wondered how many people had been influenced by the earlier teachings before this public change occurred. Others argued that the confession, while significant, did not fully address concerns that had surrounded prosperity teaching for decades. The debate soon moved beyond Dollar himself and expanded into larger discussions about accountability, influence, and responsibility within religious leadership. The conversations became increasingly intense. Social media platforms filled with clips from the sermon. News outlets reported on the story. Christian leaders shared their perspectives. Some praised the confession, others challenged it. In many ways, the event exposed deep divisions within the Christian community regarding money, giving, and biblical interpretation. Yet perhaps the most surprising development was not the criticism or the praise. It was the flood of rumors that followed. As often happens during major public events, facts and speculation quickly became mixed together. Headlines began appearing across the internet, many designed to attract attention rather than explain what had actually happened. Some reports exaggerated details, others presented assumptions as facts. Before long, a growing number of people believed that Creflo Dollar had resigned from ministry altogether. The rumor spread rapidly. For people who never watched the original sermon, the claim seemed believable. After all, a public confession from a famous pastor was already dramatic enough. Adding a resignation story made the situation appear even more stunning. As the rumor moved from one platform to another, many viewers accepted it without checking the original source. However, the facts tell a different story. Despite widespread speculation and sensational headlines, there has been no verified evidence that Creflo Dollar resigned from his ministry. While his confession generated enormous attention and sparked countless debates, he continued serving in his leadership role. The dramatic stories circulating online often went far beyond what actually took place during the sermon. This gap between reality and rumor became a lesson of its own. It showed how quickly information can change as it travels through the internet. A real event becomes a headline. The headline becomes speculation. The speculation becomes a rumor. Eventually, many people find themselves reacting to a story that no longer resembles the original facts. Meanwhile, Dollar's ministry continued moving forward. The discussions surrounding his confession remained active. But the event also became a reminder that influential leaders often face intense scrutiny whenever they make significant changes. Every statement is examined. Every decision is debated. Every action becomes part of a larger public conversation. Years from now, people may remember this moment in different ways. Some will remember it as an act of courage. Others will remember it as a controversial turning point. Still others will see it as the beginning of a broader discussion about leadership and accountability within modern Christianity. But regardless of where people stand, one fact remains clear. The event captured attention because it challenged expectations. It showed a well-known pastor publicly re-examining beliefs that had been associated with his ministry for years. And in a world where public figures rarely admit they may have been wrong, that alone was enough to create one of the most talked-about moments of his career. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.